it's quite broad saying the economics of Corbynism. And there's a whole series of sort of weird stereotypes that people have about this. That if you choose, probably, I don't imagine many people who read the Daily Telegraph. I mean, I wouldn't have thought it's not exactly on anybody's subscription list in this room. But if you read what the Telegraph says, and then if you read like this whole sort of flurry that you might have seen over the last few weeks in the Daily Mail about a set of proposals that George Monbiot and his team put together called Labour and Land, or Land for the Many, sorry. And if you looked at what that kind of slightly unhinged view of what Corbynomics is about, it's basically like, it's back to the 70s, it's nationalise everything in sight, it's print money to pay for it, and that's kind of the end of the thing. And I think what we have to be quite serious about, particularly as I think, having said for a while that I thought it was unlikely we'd get an election before 2022, basically because the Tories have this kind of clingy, sort of not wanting to be dislodged from power anytime soon kind of look about them, and because they're quite frightened of repeating what happened in 2017 when they got the shock of their lives, and they're still not really over it, by the way, in calling an early general election and then this going disastrously wrong for them, and this largely creating the mess that they're in now. But there is a risk that there's an early general election. There is a risk that most likely Boris Johnson takes over and most likely gets pushed into having to call an election at some time fairly soon. And what it imposes on us, I think, is a couple of things. One is that I think we need to be very clear about what we're arguing for and what we're not arguing for. And that part of that is trying to get over the ideas in the economics programme and get them over in a really mass sense and say to people, this is what the world could look like, this is what we're trying to achieve. The other part of it, I think, is probably more critical for all of us, which is that we have to approach this with the seriousness it deserves. Right? There is a real challenge for anyone else who's been on the left for any period of time, and looking around, I suppose perhaps a few of you have been around the left for a while, but that for a very long period of time, don't mean any insult to people in the room, by the way, but for a very long period of time, the idea that if you're on the left, you would be allowed anywhere near any actual power or government was just something that, is almost laughable, right? That for a very long period of time, probably 30 years, probably really since the failure of Tony Benn's second leadership campaign in the 80s, probably that period of time, the idea that the left would be anywhere near government and have any chance to do anything was just considered almost a joke, right? I mean, if you look at the careers of John and Jeremy, just as MPs, at best they were kind of treated as sort of household pets, by the Labour leadership. At worst, they're just a nuisance. And that's the kind of level everyone was held at. And then suddenly, in a fairly unexpected fashion, and certainly not the intention of the people who put forward the proposals on changes to how the leadership contest works and all the rest of the things that happened in 2015, suddenly we end up in this position of immense responsibility. And I think we have to treat it like that. That we're not here just to make a protest and say, aren't things terrible, somebody else should sort it out, because that's a shift. Because for 30 years, we could have just said, aren't things terrible, somebody else needs to sort it out. You point at something bad, and you wait for the government or whoever to turn up and sort it out. But if you're on the left, you're used to being a party of protest. You're not used to having to think like a party of government. So something we all have to get used to is that this is serious. That there isn't anybody else who's going to turn up and sort out this mess. It's fallen to us to have to do that. So that means we have to be very clear about what we're doing on the economy in particular, because I think this is at the dead centre of everything that has gone wrong in this country for a long period of time. And we have to win the arguments about how we're going to make things better, and we have to be completely serious about what the programme for government actually looks like when we get there. So what is Corbynomics? I think the first one, and the most obvious one, and probably the reason a lot of people got involved with the movement, probably a lot of people here got involved with the movement, is that we're going to end austerity. As Jeremy and John both said, the spending cuts have been introduced since 2010, since the coalition government, and let's not forget the role of the Liberal Democrats in all of this. They're sort of, you've seen what happens with the leadership contest over there. Let's not forget their role in enabling the Tories to implement what were and have been the worst cuts to public spending for generations, really since the 1920s, 1930s in this country. With appalling consequences, right? You don't have to go very far to see straight in front of you the consequences of now 8 years, stretching into 9 years, of austerity spending cuts. You can see the homelessness. You can see it in London very graphically. You can see it in Manchester. You can, if you want, go and read the British Medical Journal estimate that 120,000 people have been killed because of austerity. You can see when the UN Special Rapporteur turns up and says, this is a humanitarian crisis that's been created here. You can see that life expectancy is falling, like for the first time in, again, it's generations, because of what's happened to our public services and what's happening to our society as a result of these completely unnecessary, uncalled for spending cuts. Spending cuts, in the end, that were introduced for the benefit, let's be quite clear about this, of a few people at the top, at the expense of everybody else. Right? So that ends. But frankly, I think we've won that argument. I mean, look at what's happened with the two, in this case, Conservative leadership contenders, where they're falling over themselves. After years of saying there's no money, they're falling over themselves to make wild promises of tax cuts, extra money for public sector workers, funding for this, funding for that. We've won that argument, and we won it with the general public, I think, and you could see we won it, I reckon, in 2017, and to the point where Theresa May herself has had to say austerity has ended. By the way, it hasn't, and we still have to fight to do that, but I think we've won that economic argument. It was always unnecessary. It's damaged society in graphic and horrible ways. It's undermined the economy. It's done all of these things, and it has absolutely not achieved any of the promises made of it back in 2010, when George Osborne, if people remember him, first introduced his so-called emergency budget in June of that year. So we end austerity. We restore funding to the NHS, school. I mean, you can go through the list: schools, education, welfare, all the rest of it. That's what we do, and we do it in a way that's fair, because we're going to ask people who are rich, and we're going to ask large corporations to pay a contribution towards doing this. That's what we're going to do as a first step. But if we're serious about not just ending austerity, but making the economy work for everybody, and if we're serious about making an economy that works for everybody and dealing with climate change, and this is I think overwhelming. I mean, look at the weather, right? It's the overwhelming fact of life that all of us are now going to have to deal with for the rest of our lives. Right? There isn't some way around this. There's no way this thing ends. One way or the other, this has to be central to what we do. If we're going to try and deal with these massive structural problems, it isn't enough to just say we're going to fund the NHS properly or we're going to fund schools properly. We have to get into how the economy works, the institutions of the economy. And every single one of them, whether it's the Treasury, whether it's the corporations, whether it's any part that has that economic power, and change what they do. Because to be honest with you, it's not just that, the economy's battered, society's battered because of austerity. If you look at what has happened to capitalism in Britain, if you take the last 8 years, you can kind of take the last 40, but you take the last 8 years in particular. If you look at what's happened, the way in which investment, always low, has slumped, the way in which British capitalism is never particularly good at investing. It's not been a particularly high investment version of capitalism for a long period of time. That's fallen, and it's falling further at the minute, partly connected to uncertainty about Brexit, but really it predates that. Investment has fallen. By the way, at the same time that companies are hoarding record amounts of cash, there's about £700 billion sitting in company bank accounts that isn't being spent, that isn't being invested. Now, when capitalism works, it's supposed to deliver investment. That's the biggest single argument you get for it. That over a long period of time, you get growth, you get productivity improvements, you get rising wages because capitalists go and invest. If they're not doing that, this is a deeply dysfunctional version of capitalism. Never mind talking about socialism, this is dysfunctional capitalism that we're dealing with. That we don't have a high investment, therefore high productivity, therefore high wage version of capitalism. We have a low investment, therefore low productivity, therefore low wage version of capitalism. If you want a short version of what has happened to great chunks of the economy in the last sort of 8 years or so, it's basically capitalists, instead of investing in the equipment, the machinery, the skills, all the other things that they ought to be doing, in theory, this is what should be happening, instead of doing that, which is difficult and risky, and you have to think about the future, and frankly, if you're very, very short-term, like British capitalism is, you don't think about that, so you don't do this, you substitute with cheap labour. You have zero-hour contracts on a massive scale, you have real wages, are now lower, still lower today than they were in 2010. This, by the way, it's pretty much unprecedented. You have to go back, it seems, to sort of Napoleonic Wars, the Industrial Revolution, to find a period of time where most people's living standards have declined in the way they have over the last few years. This is unprecedented. And it's unprecedented because we have a deeply dysfunctional version of capitalism, which is not about investment, not about improving productivity, new technology, all these things that capitalism is supposed to be about, and they can talk about it as much as they want back down in Whitehall, but it's not happening here. It just isn't. We have a version of capitalism which is deeply extractive. It's about getting money wherever you can, however you can. It doesn't really matter how you do it. And there's a version of that. You can see it. You can see in the dependency and debt that you had up until 2008, this incredible expansion of debt. Basically, households, ordinary people, loaded with more and more debt, until the debt bubble burst, as it always does in 2008. Prior to that point, British households became the most heavily indebted of any major developed economy. And then we're supposed to have this period of paying off debts, and that does happen for a while. But if you look over the last few years, because wages are low, by the way, this isn't people going mad getting another holiday year, because wages are low, very, very large numbers of people are having to borrow more and more just to get to the end of the month. And you can see this happening. You can see it's not just mortgage lending that's going up, it's unsecured lending. It's borrowing on credit cards, it's going into overdrafts, it's getting into, worst of all, sort of payday loans and this sort of thing. That is starting to creep up. And it's creeping up because people aren't paid enough. And to make ends meet, they end up borrowing money. That's the most sort of, extreme version of a debt-driven capitalism you can get to. And that's the kind of world we've ended up with here. So if you want to just change that, it's not enough to say we're going to spend a bit more money. Like, there's a deep institutional failure here. There's a deep institutional failure when, if you look at what little investment does take place, by government in this case, that you have this great concentration of it, all happening, you say London and South East. That's kind of true, but it's not like the streets are paved with gold or whatever. It's for the benefit of a small section of London, which is the City of London, and really it's just a small section of people within that small section of London. So you get an extraordinary discrepancy between the, £1,300, £1,500 per head spent in London on transport and the £300 per head spent in Yorkshire. Incredible divergence in what different parts of the country get in the limited amount of investment that's actually taking place. So one of the things we absolutely have to do, and we said we do in 2017, we're going to stick to it, is invest on a very large scale in the public transport, in the renewable energy, I'll come back to this point, in all the things we need to get an economy that's just off the starting blocks, and to do it in a way that isn't reproducing this incredible discrepancy where a few parts, a tiny bit of the country basically has everything piled up in it and everybody else gets nothing. So we have to shift that. So we're going to invest £250 billion through the National Transformation Fund over 10 years to make that happen. And to help with the delivery of this, and to not just say, okay, we're going to spend money, it's not going to be great, but to make sure we lock these changes in place, we're going to get hold of the Treasury and rewrite its rules. Now, somewhat for my sins, I did work there for a while, once upon a time, and it's, if you're talking about neoliberalism and what neoliberal capitalism has got us to in this country, in other words, not the kind of Keynesian, if you like, capitalism of the post-war period, the 50s, 60s, 70s, but the capitalism that Margaret Thatcher introduced mostly. The capitalism that we've ended up with, it's all about privatisation, it's all about financial markets doing whatever the hell they want, deregulation. It's about piling up debt. It's about, as we've seen since the end of the crisis, it's about low wages arrest, but huge inequalities of wealth, huge discrepancies inside the economy. If you're talking about dealing with neoliberalism, you have to shake this out of Whitehall and get rid of it from the institutions in Whitehall. So you need to rewrite the rule book for the Treasury in particular, and get to the point where instead of thinking about, because this is how they end up thinking, what's good for the City of London is probably going to be good for everybody else. Not true. We know it's not true because 2008 happens and the rest of us are paying for it. That we have to get to the point where we think about what's good for the rest of the country. More than that, what's good to deal with the climate crisis and the climate emergency that we're heading into. So there's a serious need to get into the institutions of the economy and not just say, okay, here we are, we're going to spend some more money. But we're going to change how those institutions function, and we're going to change them so we start thinking more about society and environment and less about what ultimately, in this case, finance capital wants and how the economy could be structured around its needs. So that, I think, is a critical part of it. And it may or may not be something, on the proverbial doorstep to say, hey, we're going to change the Green Book in the Treasury, we're going to introduce a lower discount rate in order that it thinks a bit more about the longer term. It's probably not always going to be something that turns up. But I think it's critical that we have an understanding that the institutions we want to try and change this economy themselves have to change. We're going to have to try and make things work differently to how they have in the past. I think as part of that, of course, we want to say, and there's a discussion about this, and really this is I'd say a personal opinion, but I think we have to move this way. That if we have a 2050 target date to get to a net zero position, in other words, the greenhouse gas emissions from, well, basically everything we do in this country will be zero by that point net, allowing for the fact you're going to plant more trees and this sort of thing to suck up some of the carbon and potentially other greenhouse gases. That 2050, for a date to do that, which is now the government's official position, simply isn't going to be good enough. Now, we can see that all the extraordinary thing, and if you think about it the wrong way, it becomes incredibly depressing. The extraordinary thing about climate change is every time you think you have some bad news, there's some worse news that appears. That every prediction you make turns out to be too optimistic. That you can see that this is a process that is going faster than some of the more pessimistic forecasts would have said. So we have to move faster than this. We also, I think, and I think this is an important internationalist point, we also have to take account of the fact that this is a country where the Industrial Revolution started, right? We spent basically 200 years digging up coal and burning it. The contribution that Britain has made to the climate change we have over that period of time is per capita larger than any other country on earth. We have a responsibility to move faster because of this. Because frankly, you can't turn around and say, okay, we'll get to a net zero carbon position by 2050, and that means that every other country in the world, regardless of how developed they are, they're all going to have to reduce their emissions as well. You can't really turn around to say, hey, we had a great old time burning coal, developing our society, developing the economy. Really sorry, everybody, you're going to have to not do this. We're not going to do that. We're going to take some responsibility for this, move the target date further forwards, and have an internationalist position where we say we are going to take a lead in doing this. And I think we should treat it as something fundamental to what we're doing if we're saying we want a new, different economy. That if you want to talk about what is Corbynomics, it's fundamental saying we want to be a leading country in decarbonisation, in reducing the environmental damage that our economy is causing, and it will be the government that takes the lead in that, and will try and deliver the mechanisms throughout the whole economy that will deliver this. So I think we set a tighter target, and I think we change how institutions, the core institutions of the economy, think about what they're doing. This was John's speech from a couple of weeks ago, talking about how do we get finance to think about climate. Now, it caused a bit of a stir in the city, frankly. It was City AM, which is a sort of tabloid for the City of London, I suppose. It's you can imagine what it's like. They had a few bankers popping up on the front page saying it's financial totalitarianism. How dare somebody suggest that we might have to change what we're doing? Well, you are going to have to change what you're doing. You can't carry on investing in digging coal out of the ground elsewhere in the world in the most terrible conditions. You can't carry on just blithely assuming at some point in the future climate change is going to be solved. We have to do this now. You have to change what you invest in. So we are going to change the rules about how that operates, and we're going to do it with a view to delivering that tighter decarbonisation target. And I think we should be quite clear. If it comes up as an argument, I would say that we have to be quite clear about 2050 isn't good enough. We have to be much more ambitious, much more internationalist, meet our commitments to the rest of the world, and aim for a much tighter target on that. But if you take another part of what I think a different economy would look like, this kind of socialist economics, of what Corbynism represents and what we should be doing, beyond ending austerity, beyond all that's related to saying we're going to tackle climate change, we're going to take it seriously, along with wider environmental damage, biodiversity loss, and the various other things that don't get quite so much attention, but they're all creeping up on us at a rapid rate. I think one of the principles we also have to get to is that, look, we don't want people's lives to be dominated by the market. We don't think it's right that great chunks of things that should be a right, like education, are being handed over to a market of some form and then treated as if it's just a commodity. In other words, we're going to take things that are currently in the market out of the market, and as far as possible make it free for everyone, because this is the fair, right thing to do. This is a very, very rich society. We should be able to have mechanisms, institutions, that can deliver for everyone without the need to say, let's have a market that's going to allocate this. So education is the obvious one. It should never, tuition fees should never be introduced. So scrap it, right? Education is a right. It's not some privilege, and it's certainly not a privilege where you have to borrow, £21,000 or more just to pay for your tuition for 3 years, which you're then saddled with for the rest of your life in some cases. We're going to make a national education service which will deliver free education like the NHS delivers free healthcare from cradle to the grave or thereabouts for everybody, because it's a right. It's something that we should have free. In a rich, developed economy, this is something that should be happening. But we can go further than that. We can say that there's an argument, and I think it's a good one, around universal basic services. Can we not provide free public transport to everyone? And the reason you do that, the climate change benefits are really obvious. If you get people out of their cars, immediately this has an impact on how much damage you're doing to the environment. So you can start to think about free public transport would be one of the things we need to start looking into and getting towards. You can start to stack up other variants of this. Why not, as in the Universal Basic Services report, why not free communications? Why not free broadband? Why? Because this has got to the point where it's an essential of existence, I'd say, in a modern society to have access to the internet. So why not make sure that happens? But also then I think another argument that's bubbling up and something that we need to start thinking about is we're taking things and commodities out of the market, we're making them free because we think it's a right. Why not give people the most fundamental possession they can have, which is their time? Why not look at reductions in working time? Why not look at saying, we've had a 5-day week for, since the 1920s, 1930s, where it becomes standard. This is a very long period of time. This is a massively richer society than it was back then, but we're still stuck with this period of time. Why not say to people, we'll give you the genuine ability to take more time off, to have a 4-day week as standard with no loss of pay, and this will be a huge shift in how people work and the distribution of the resources in society. And I think also, by the way, one that will be popular. If we can credibly tell people we want to do this, then I think it'll be very, very popular indeed. If you look at what's happened to how a lot of people, maybe not most, but maybe is most, now most people end up working now. For far too many people, it is low paid, it's insecure. If you're on a 0 hours contract or you're working for some agency, your life is barely your own anymore. Why not give them back their time? Why not have that change in how society operates and thinks, that suddenly you're giving people something that is almost the most precious thing they can have? So this is an important part of that principle of decommodification. You're taking people out of the labour market. They don't need to be in the labour market so much. They have the time to do things themselves. But at the dead centre of this, this I think is the most critical part of what Corbynomics is, what we're trying to do, is this completely central question of who owns the economy and society that we live in. Because if you look at the figures, and if you see what's happened, you can take the last 40 years. If you look at the figures from Tamar Piketty and a few other people, Britain moves, at the end of the 1970s, from being one of the most equal societies in the Western world to today being one of the most unequal. And what's happened in the last 40 years, it's basically my entire life plus a bit, he says for now, there's been this incredible process of transferring the resources of society under the guise, this was always, I dread to mention the name, but this was always Margaret Thatcher's argument, under the guise of giving people, a property-owning democracy and everybody's going to be their own capitalist and God knows what else. Under this guise, the most extraordinary transfer of the wealth and resource of society to the top. And once they're sitting at the top, poorly managing, by the way, those resources, that wealth. Look at the state of the trains, look at the state of what's happened to water, look at all the various things that were privatised, they should never have been. So we're just going to correct that mistake and move these things back into public ownership because they should never have been in private ownership in the first place. Privatisation of utilities, railways, go through the list, has been basically disastrous in terms of our economy, our society, how we live our lives. So we're going to bring that back in because it should never have been taken away in the first place. But we have to go further than this. And the reason we have to go further than this, I think, is, we'll put it in a historical context. I think this is where we got to. If you look at how British capitalism has changed over the last sort of 70 years or so since the war, there have been two really big reforming governments that made a spectacular difference. One in a good way, one in a bad way. So you take Attlee's government of 1945. It's a huge transfer of wealth from private hands, productive wealth, from private hands to the public. So you have the nationalisation of the coal mines. You get rid of these sort of basically despotic and useless private coal owners, put them in the hands of the National Coal Board. You do this in the end for about 20% of the economy. You set up a national health service. It's a similar thing. You don't have private healthcare. You kind of move it into a public provision. It's a huge shift in ownership. If you look at Thatcher, it's a huge shift in ownership. It's massive privatisation. It's the right to buy. It's a shift for public resources back into private hands. We need to have a vision that what we're doing is something on that scale, because it has to be on that scale. Because we know that a kind of privatised version of capitalism can't deal too well with climate change. It produces massive inequality. There's no investment. There's low wages. You're going to have to do something about the ownership and control of productive assets in this country. And I think our version of that is saying not that, therefore, the choices are, and this is what the neoliberals always pose it as, by the way. They want you to think about it like this. Oh, well, if it's not in private sector, some corporation owning something, it has to be nationalised. Well, actually, no, I don't think we need to think like that. I think there's other different ways we can think about ownership and how we own the useful, productive assets of this country. And I think it's something we have to do. Just to give an example of what I mean. If we want to decarbonise rapidly in Britain, the quickest, easiest and now cheapest way to do this is to get into our electricity system and start using a lot more onshore wind. Onshore wind today, because the technology's really advanced a lot in the last few years, onshore wind today is cheaper than gas. Right? It's the cheapest way you can get electricity. And frankly, we live in a small windy island. It's mad not to use this immense resource. There are problems with doing this. One of them is that we have a government that is militantly opposed to doing onshore wind anywhere. But the other one starts to look a bit like this, that if you say, OK, we're going to build loads of onshore wind farms, this is a cheap, effective way to decarbonise our energy supply, to get rid of greenhouse gases, get renewables in. You have to build those wind farms all the way across the country because you have to go where it's windy. The windy places are often the places that are quite, picturesque. And the people who live there, not unreasonably, don't necessarily want their nice view and their nice environment that they have spoiled by a wind farm. And if you just turn up, and this is the problem you run up against, if you just turn up and say, well, this is the big nationalised electricity generating concern, whatever you're going to call it, British Electric or something, it's going to turn up and it's going to build a wind farm here. They won't like that. And they won't like that if it's a big privatised energy company that turns up and just says, we're going to build a wind farm here. But if you give them ownership over the wind farm, if you say, actually, this is going to be your wind farm for your community, you will get some of the money from it, you can decide what's done with the thing, you will own it, those issues melt away. And you can see, countries do this. Denmark has 100,000, they call them, what do they call them? Wind trusts, community wind trusts, where you have local ownership of small-scale generation, and it means that Denmark is the leading country in the world on generating electricity from wind. Similar thing now happening in Germany. So you can see how it works. Now, the issue here is that this isn't just going, oh, it's privatised, it's a big corporation that does it. It isn't just going, oh, it's nationalised, it's the government that does it. It's giving people meaningful ownership on a local, decentralised basis. It's a form of collective ownership, but it's decentralised. And I think that's a really good principle to think about how we can apply it to the rest of the economy. I think, people have probably heard about the Preston model and what they're doing at Preston Council down the road from here. Part of this is trying to support local business, support the local economy, get major employers to spend locally and that sort of thing. The next stage of this is, can they convert or set up worker-owned companies that will be putting the wealth back in the hands of the employees, that won't be just some big, faceless multinational somewhere else with the wealth disappearing from Preston, but it's actually there, right there, because it's held by the people who work there and who live there. Can we start to roll this out right the way across the country? And I think there is an opportunity to do that, which is why one of the most important, and in many ways the most radical, single policy proposals that we've had, certainly since 2017, since the manifesto was produced, was the inclusive ownership funds, which is basically saying that every year we'll expect large companies, those employing more than 250 people, to place 1% of their shares into a pot which will be owned collectively by the workers. Every year they'll do that. So over time, the workers come to own a greater and greater share of every single large company. And you do that because you know that when you have worker ownership, companies behave differently. They think about the long term. They invest for the long term. They think about wider society. It changes how companies behave. And you want that to happen because you want companies that invest for the long term and think about their obligations to society. You also do it because, after years of falling wages, suddenly you're giving people a share of the dividends that these companies are paying out. Suddenly you're giving people a real boost to their spending. And you're doing it because you're locking in place a change in how productive assets are owned in this country. So it's a big shift in how the economy operates. You stack all this together, and this is what Corbynism or Corbynomics, I think, starts to look like. That you have serious action on climate change, that you deliver investment across the whole country to meet the challenge of climate change and to close those enormous discrepancies in how our economy operates from some bits of London to basically everywhere else. That you change ownership. You bring things that should never have been privatised back into public ownership, and you start to think more creatively about forms of collective ownership for other productive assets, renewable energy, large corporations, worker ownership of small-scale production. You can start to do all of these things. Stack all this together, and at the end of it, you get a very different vision of society. You start to get an economy that's much more equal. John had quite a nice phrase in this, and this, I think, is where we want to get to. Is that you get an economy that's radically fairer, radically more democratic, and environmentally sustainable. That's the vision that lies behind all of this. That, I think, is the serious strategy in how to get there. It's a series of, it gets beyond just saying we're going to spend more money, tax the rich. Yes, we're going to do that, but we have to get into how our economy operates at its roots. And we have to grab hold of them and change it, and we have to do it in a way that makes life better for ordinary working people in this country and for wider society. Thank you. So I think it's an excellent idea, right? I think it's a really, really good thing that New Zealand has done in terms of shifting their own treasury, which is it's very similar to the one we have here. It basically thinks about nothing but economic growth, and its version of that economic growth is, for the treasury here, as long as you get growth in like the City of London, it's all good. It doesn't really matter, right? So instead of doing that, saying how do we think about having they've called it a well-being budget. So they want to say instead, how do we have a treasury that thinks about how do we improve the well-being of society? And I think that's a really, really good model to take. That we can't just say let's make GDP go up, right? I mean, the promise of GDP is broken down. It used to be that GDP, the measure of the economy, what we normally think about when we say economic growth. GDP goes up for 60 years or so. That usually meant basically wages go up and there's more jobs, right? That's what it's supposed to mean. What's happened over the last 8 years or so, really since 2008, 2010 certainly, is GDP's gone up a bit. I mean, growth has not been particularly impressive, but wages are falling. So in other words, what's the most basic level? What is the point of chasing GDP if it's not actually delivering for most people? Right, so we have to do something else. So we need to think about what are the environmental targets we want to meet. What are the jobs we want to create, and are they good jobs, right? And are we going to monitor that? Why aren't we looking at real wages, how much money people have, rather than just looking abstractly at GDP, which doesn't mean very much to people. So I think it's a really, really good example. For what it's worth, I've got, if people are interested, I've got written a chapter for a book that is out on Monday from Commonwealth, one of the new sort of think tanks looking at these things, called Greening the Treasury, which gets into and says, as an example, we should be adopting that New Zealand model of radically changing how your institutions function to try and help deliver a better society.
Great, I'll take a couple of questions, yeah.
So you mentioned this policy of 1% of a company every year going to the workers. That sounds great as a vision, but that's a 1% of companies which are worth billions. That's the value of that policy to get around. It's what a company has that 1% of their total value incentive to avoid this policy. So you could see a scenario where employees start just becoming subcontractors as a result of like that. So how would you control for things like that?
Good. Take one more for now. Yeah. So, yeah.
I used to work for UCAP.
Oh, yeah.
And we always had a theory, and still UCAP and other people still push it, that if you start building houses, you kickstart the economy, not just the housing, people are buying carpets and God knows what. That was before there was concerns about the environment. So how do you, I believe you still can kickstart it by house building, and we're in a desperate need for houses. How do you do that and still have an environmentally friendly way of doing it?
Shall I come back to that, or do you want
to? Yeah. Take one more.
Well, it was really interesting what you're saying, particularly about taking things back into public ownership, like free transport. But I would include housing in that. I think housing is a basic fundamental right, and if you offer people free housing, it destroys the inequality about people being born with houses for their family. I think housing should be seen as transport as a crucial right. And also, I think it was great you talked about taking things back into public ownership in a different way. I mean, I'm old enough to remember that British Rail, which actually wasn't very popular, wasn't very effective. And I think it's crucial when we take things back And I think some of that will have to be done nationally, but we need to come up with creative ways of making that actually much more consumer-friendly, consumer-influenced. And I suppose my final point would be around how do we actually win this argument? Because I think what was in the manifesto was really popular, but at the moment, Labour's not popular. I think Brexit is completely, the argument is not arbitrary about Brexit, and I think how we resolve that is crucial. So I think we need to get, that is what has to be gone through till we can get to this room. Any thoughts on that would be great.
We so carefully avoided talking about Brexit, you might have noticed, but since it's there. And I might do the same thing now, but that's not necessarily desirable. Look, I think you're right. The issue is, the really critical issue for us, actually there's several, but in the middle of it is how do we win the next election? Because we can draw up whatever proposals we want and have all these great ideas, but we really do need to win the next election. So how do we get from point A here to point B, which is having won? 2017 was really good, but we should bear in mind we didn't actually win, right? So what do we do to improve that next time round? There's a series of challenges I think we face around that. One of them is that it's tempting to do this, but we can't, which is photocopy the 2017 manifesto, say, that was good, wasn't it? And then assume that people, still want to vote for it next time round. No, a bunch of people will, because it was good. But we have to do more than this now. We've shifted the dial. What happened in 2017 is basically we broke this sort of nonsense belief that things like public ownership, free education, taxing the rich, the sort of common sense view of the sort of centrist commentators and that kind of chunk in the middle was that these things are just electoral suicide if you talk about any of them. Well, we demolished that. But then what do you do next? And the what do you do next, I think, also includes some problems that are now much bigger than they were in 2017. Climate change is utterly unavoidable. It wasn't really avoidable in 2017. We had pretty good green policy sitting there, but now I think it has to be right in the middle of everything we do. And I think there's some more difficult issues around that are bearing down us around automation, around use of data. What is Facebook doing, busily trying to set up an alternative currency for the entire world? There's sort of kind of quite big questions that we're going to have to get our heads around and think about how to address them. We're going to have to think quite creatively on that. So these are all the reasons how we're going to try and get there to win the election next time round. But I think it's also a question of what is the coalition that gets us over the line? Because it will be a coalition. I'd like to think everybody in the country is a socialist or something, and some people are and some people aren't. And over time, we can probably convince everyone we should do that, but also we're going to have to get a load of people who don't think of themselves as socialists to vote for us one way or the other. And I think there's a serious argument to have, and I hope it is a serious argument, about how our Brexit position fits into that, because I think that's what it comes down to, right? That's not to be cynical about this. I'm not cynically saying, we'll just determine it on what the electoral consequences are, because it's bigger than that. The really important question for Britain right now, the really big question is, can we get a socialist government? Right? That's the really big question. And all our decisions should be, how do we get there? Right? So that's where, and I'm happy to have a discussion about Brexit, but maybe another time on precisely what that looks like. So that's one bit of it. If you're talking about what we do that's different on public ownership, there's a really good paper by We Own It, which is submitted to the sort of, National Policy Forum process on different kinds of public ownership, bringing in more democracy, learning from the mistakes of the past. Because the truth was, when Thatcher turned up and says, we'll privatise things, she was picking up on something that people said, actually, this stuff isn't as good as it could be. Right? British Rail was not great. It wasn't. It was what we have now is less great and more expensive in lots of ways. But we can do better. And we can do better in every single step of the way. Same thing goes with energy production. We're going to have to make allowance for a large amount of decentralisation of generation, because we're going to have loads of renewables. You can't just build one big wind farm in the middle of the country like you can with a nuclear power plant or something, right? You have to have decentralised ownership. We're going to have to do things differently in that one. The other question is, housing is all right, and what do you do to kickstart the economy in terms of house building? There's a couple of things there. I think we need more houses, right? Depending on where you are in the country, this is either a really pressing need or not. I also think we can make much better use of the housing stock we've got. I think part of that is not having an economy where basically everything ends up in the big cities and there are no jobs anywhere else, right? Because that's kind of how it's ended up. You can see it in the centre of Manchester, it's the same thing in central London on a bigger scale, right? So we need jobs across the whole country. We need them to be good, solid, green jobs. We need, that has to be part of the decarbonisation process. If you do that, you'll start to, I think, remove some of the pressures of housing stock in the big cities. So it kind of ties in together. We also, I think, and this was in the 2017 manifesto, but it's a really good, simple, if very large scale, decarbonisation thing, which is you insulate everybody's loft properly. Like, we have quite an old housing stock. It means our houses are not particularly energy efficient. So you insulate them properly. It's a huge task. You need many tens of thousands of people doing this over a long period of time. You create loads of good, solid jobs. It's lots and lots of, kickstarting the economy in lots of different ways. But that's one of the things you can start to do to make the houses we have work better for people. And that's really good, by the way, because it means you cut people's energy bills and you're not, damaging the environment quite so much. If you want to build new houses, I think we have to be serious about getting into making sure that every single house we build corresponds to some of the low energy standards, like passive house is the classic one, where you have houses that effectively you can run them all year round without actually using any heating, because they're so well designed, so well insulated. That's the kind of stuff we have to get to. And if we start to have a housing programme that puts that in the middle, these are the kind of houses you want. And I think social housing is a critically important part of what you're doing there. That, I think, can look like a very, very attractive offer that will create jobs. It's environmentally friendly. You're doing a bit for decarbonisation and all the rest of it. Okay.
On that point about public ownership, I think I should mention that our last one of these events was specifically about democratic public ownership with Kat Hobbs and Andy Cumbers. And I think we will be putting that up on SoundCloud soon if you've missed it and you want to go back and listen to it.
James, I just missed one question.
Oh, did we? Which one did I miss? Did I write it all down?
Inclusive ownership.
Oh, yeah, right. No, I did. I'm really sorry about that. No, I had written it down. That could have been quite a cunning ploy, but it wasn't. I genuinely did miss it. Yeah, I think it's a really good question, right? Because we want to do something we want to do something quite ambitious here, right? That's putting it fairly mildly. That if you're saying large companies are going to convert over time to sort of collective ownership, worker ownership. And, oh, by the way, this is, for years, various governments have had this thing about, we really like worker ownership, we really like it if this happens. And you create all sorts of tax breaks and you wait for it to happen, it doesn't, right? So we're going to make sure companies do this. We're going to ask them to do this. We're going to mandate them to do this. Will they want to try and avoid that? Well, potentially. I mean, to be honest with you, you can do a nice version of this. Potentially, that can work out better for your shareholders. If you have more worker ownership, it is very clear on the evidence that worker-owned companies, or companies with significant worker ownership, are more productive, they invest more, returns over time are better. It's actually quite a good, solid capitalist case for doing this, if you want that. If people do want to avoid it, I think the problems you get into are basically the same as tax avoidance. And by the way, we are going to clamp down tax avoidance. In other words, the issues of maybe they'll try and register their company elsewhere, that sort of thing. These are the same sort of issues you get with dealing with tax avoidance, which we also have to deal with. We close the tax havens. We introduce, proper transparency of where companies are registered, that kind of thing. So there's similar sets of issues. Again, there's a paper being drafted, in this case by Matt Lawrence, and published again by Commonwealth, coming out it should be out in a month or so ahead of conference, which goes into some of the details of how we can actually implement this and make it work and make it watertight. Because if we do it, it's huge, right? And kind of people realise it's huge, which is why the Financial Times and other things get very, very excited about it. But this can be a really, really good, positive way in which we shift the balance of ownership and control and power in this country decisively towards people who work.
Great. Take 2 questions for now. Yeah, at the back.
I just wanted to kind of bring up some of the things about how to fund this kind of massive investment we need and how to harness all that uninvested wealth that you mentioned.
Yep.
One of the main ways is the tax and spend kind of idea that we tax the rich to fund this stuff. How do you see problems with that in terms of the fact that obviously taxes cut further into profits, higher wages cut further into profits, and thus reduce investment? Similarly with shared ownership funds, it seems to me like that's just a way of actually just trying to tie the interests of workers and bosses together, and kind of when actually the rules of the market would still apply and you still have the same race to the bottom. Again, with the kind of the Preston model kind of idea that we can outsource to local businesses, you still have the same market relations, the same race to the bottom that you have the problem with outsourcing. Just because it's local doesn't change that. And as well with the expansion of co-ops and decentralized workers control things, you still have inequalities between different sectors, and again, they're still functioning on that competitive model. And you can't actually do the kind of large-scale economic planning that is what socialism is all about. So just from my perspective, I think in order to really harness all that wealth and power in the economy, really nationalisation across the whole of the principal levers of the economy, and with workers' control as well, like what you mentioned about the top-down principle nationalisations, it's definitely true to make it responsive. We need workers' control, but we also need to be able to plan the economy centrally and be very clear about what is socialism and what's tinkering around the edges of capitalism.
Right, and then one more over there.
I wanted to ask what is in some sense a related question, which is, I realize you don't want to talk about Brexit, but just in terms of your economic model, it sounds a great idea to construct socialism in one country. But the question is, can this sort of socialism actually be constructed in one country, especially if we have an extremely hostile world? And the other thing is, you made a comparison with the situation with the Attlee government, radical reforms and nationalisation. But the state of the economy in those days was very, very different. And there was a great deal of production, which was actually going on in this country, which practically disappeared. Now we are tremendously dependent on imports. And we're also tremendously dependent on the exploitation of labour. You mentioned what a wealthy country we are, but to a large extent this actually depends on the super exploitation of people in India, China, and other parts of the world, South America. So I wondered how the international picture fits into your economic model.
Yeah, should I take those two together? Because it's sort of, I think they're related. So I'll go with the international thing, then get onto the planning. They're both really good questions. I'm glad you asked it because I didn't really spend any time on either of them. There is something quite important that's happened since 2008. That if we have an idea that we live in a globalised world and people know all the rhetoric about it, and it's quite familiar that it's attached to a version of neoliberalism that says there is no alternative, that you can't do anything that disrupts the global markets because you'll be destroyed by finance and the interest rates will go up and it's a disaster and all that. That kind of rhetoric, particularly in the 90s. It was one version of justifications for New Labour. One side of it was always saying, well, we have to do this because of globalisation. It's just how the world is now, right? There is no alternative. It's the end of history. And that's a version of it. That if you want to do something left-wing that disrupts what the market wants, you're going to get smashed. You can't do that. And that depended on saying that globalisation was happening. And if you take the period between roughly 1980 and 2008, the world economy grows. World trade grows faster than the world economy. In other words, more and more stuff is being traded relative to the national economies, right? So more of each economy is becoming traded. This is globalisation in terms of trade. And then finance grows even faster than trade. And this is the huge expansion of global financial flows over that period of time. This is globalisation. This is what people think about. This is the monster that we have to deal with, right? What's happened since 2008 is fascinating. Global financial flows are down 60% since 2008. It's gone right down. So that big, powerful financial system is not working in quite the way that it used to. Global trade is growing less than the global economy. In other words, countries are starting, relative to economic growth, they're trading less. So in a certain sense, globalization in the way we think of it before 2008 isn't there. And what this means critically, I think, for us, and actually for anybody else in the world, is that you've just got a bit more freedom. You've got a bit more space to do something different. Because the big forces that were supposed to be there that would crush you utterly, like finance will turn up and do you over, right? It's not there in quite the same way anymore. That what used to be a world centred through the financial system and just, really it's Washington and New York are the most powerful parts of the entire global economy. Well, you can see it in the trade war between the US and China. You can see that this is an increasingly multipolar world, and that means there are spaces where you can do different things. So I think from that point of view, we've got a bit of room. We've got some wriggle room to try something different on that. And there are other parts of this. You mentioned production not taking place. There's something quite strange that's happening, or interesting that's happening to production. There's about 1 in 6 manufacturers have moved some jobs back to Britain in the last few years. They call it reshoring. And there's a number of reasons why this is happening. One is that, if I'm going to get the figures right, if you take average manufacturing wages in Shenzhen, in China, they're not far off what you get paid in Greece now, per hour, right? So that gap in wages has started to close really quite substantially. What's happening in China, by the way, is they move production inland, right? And that's why you get trains arriving from China in East London now, because it's cheaper to send things over land than by sea at that point. But that is this thing about there is always some cheaper labour elsewhere that capitalists can go to. It doesn't quite apply in the same way. That a lot of the time, particularly people making stuff, want to locate next to their markets, and they produce in shorter runs. And you can see the shift in technology with 3D printing, cyber physical system. I'm really drifting into jargon here, but basically lots and lots of robots, lots of digitization, lots of very advanced manufacturing starts to move back to places where wages are actually quite high. We can make use of that. So these are the big trends in global capitalism that kind of work in favour of, I think, of the sort of programme we're laying out here. And that's why I'm reasonably optimistic we've got a bit of space to do this thing. On the planning side, I think you're absolutely right. There's a really good book. I'd strongly recommend people have a read of it, which is called The People's Republic of Walmart by his name wrong. Lee Phillips and Michal Rozwolski. Pretty certain I pronounced that wrong, but it's an excellent book. And it basically makes the case that large parts of capitalism right now are in fact planned, right? So Walmart is, it's a huge company, huge global company with very, very advanced planning to get the whole thing to work. Because if you think about it, capitalism has always worked like this. You get, as the man said, the anarchy of the marketplace, but despotism in a factory, right? You have planning and hierarchy inside, and everything else is the anarchy of the marketplace. So that's already there. Those tools are already there. And I think one of the things that's quite potentially exciting now is that if you start to say something like, we have a decarbonisation target that's quite tight, well, it's 2030, 2040, whatever, it's not 2050, but quite tight. In order to get there, we will have to plan at least some part of the economy. We'll have to plan the change in the energy system, right? At least the centralised bits of it. And we'll have to set targets on how much renewable energy use we want. But you can set this and then still have the decentralised delivery towards the plan. And you can do this if you start to say, well, hang on, this was Graham Turner, who's a city economist really, but a good one, and a friendly one, who wrote a report for John last year on how the Bank of England could start to use its levers on setting interest rates and controlling where credit goes a bit more creatively in order to reach some of those targets. So you can build in a plan, because we're going to decarbonise the economy. This is a huge 10-year programme that's going to involve a large degree of planning right at the top, alongside a degree of decentralisation when you say, how do we deliver towards the plan? So I think you can get the two things together. The further part of that is, you're absolutely right. If you just have worker ownership, then, you just you can easily be you can be very pro-capitalist and say, it's great worker ownership, but it's just capitalism because the market's determining everything. If you have that alongside saying, we are interested in getting things out of the market. I mean, there's a peculiar thing with capitalism at the minute, that great chunks of it are disappearing from the market already. Like, what does Facebook say every time you log on? It's free and it always will be. There's no market here. I mean, they make their money elsewhere, as it turns out. Thank you, Cambridge Analytica, right? But there's no market. And price competition starts to disappear from great chunks of what we're doing. So that's already happening. How can we make that work in a positive way? How can we make it so, instead of it's Facebook sucking away all your data, it's actually us getting free education? The process of decommodification in this sense can happen both ways. So if we have worker ownership and we're removing the market, I think we're getting towards the point where it's addressing some of your questions, right? But it has to be, if you take decarbonisation as the big target we want to get to, that is a 10-year programme at that point, at least. Sure.
Great, yeah.
Just a point. On the Bank of England, do you think its independence should be questioned if future Labour government? And sort of on this point of sort of accountability and autonomy, you talk about the Treasury.
Yep.
Obviously, by extension, you need the civil service and the state apparatus and wider social policy to deliver the reforms that are funded through the Treasury.
Yep.
What type of reforms do you think, if any, would have to be made to a civil service? And there's been talk over the past few years about sort of the potential for any radical reforms to be limited by staff in the civil service who have been there for decades. So how do you sort of navigate that tension between continuity in the civil service and the need to implement radical change?
That's a very good question. Do you want to take some more? Should we just
Take that one for now. Or?
Yeah, go on.
So Shoshana is involved obviously like against capitalism, and you've spoken a bit about Facebook. How do you deal with the entrenchment of against capitalism across different companies? So the financial sector, obviously in Barcelona, I think they sort of create like a citizens' rights.
Yeah.
Like how do you apply that in your economies? And then I had like another question as well, which was G4S and Circle. Companies like this are quite entrenched in carceral states, in detention centres, and in prisons. So when it comes to nationalisation, is that like an opportunity to maybe move away from carceral state as well? And thinking of Labour and the way that, especially in the local elections, the case of like policing, etc., and thinking of the impact this has, especially on communities of colour and working class communities.
One more question? In the middle? Yeah.
Do you think stronger regional powers is a means of achieving this as well, or would that be too contrary to the sort of grand central planning that's required?
Anyone else? All right. I think it's essential, right? One of the issues we're up against, and there's a lot of things that tie together, is if you take the centre of the British economy and how it's organised, and the centre of like how government is organised, it sits in Whitehall. We live in basically about the most centralised state of any developed economy. I mean, we sort of vie with Japan or something, but it's up there. And that was quite a deliberate thing. That was deliberately brought, it's Thatcher again, during the 80s to basically smash up local autonomy and centralise what councils can do, to remove sources of local power. If we want to take on neoliberalism, which is deeply embedded in the structures of how the British state organises itself, right, and how, with the best will in the world, this is like how the civil service thinks, broadly speaking. After 40 years of neoliberalism, they all think a bit neoliberal, right? So with the best will in the world, it's going to be hard to move that. If we want things to happen that aren't neoliberal, we're going to have to also decentralise. We're going to have to take things out of that particular set of structures. So I'm very much in favour of this. I think we could do with more discussion as part of Labour's programme as to what that would look like. We have some implements. We said we want regional development banks. You know, these could be a very important part of getting regional economies to operate. I don't think there needs to be a tension between that and saying, let's have an overall plan, because you give people a space in which they can set what they do on the ground, roughly in line with what you want to achieve overall. And that's why decarbonisation, reducing environmental damage, is a good one to do, because it sets a target and people can make their own way there in terms of what is appropriate for local economies and the rest of it. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think we need to think and actually get to the point of policy and what are the additional decentralisation things we can do. I mean, to an extent, and this is getting onto the civil service point, to an extent, we kind of have to win before we win the election. Right? We have to demonstrate already that some of this stuff can work. The Preston model is one version of it. Jamie Driscoll up in Newcastle is another. We have to say right now that this can work and this is what we're going to do. And we do that because I think, and John was always very clear about this, and I think he's right to be clear. What is the biggest defence against not being able to implement things properly? Let's put it no more strongly than that. The biggest defence against it is being completely open and honest about what we want to do. And having a well-informed movement that knows what we want to do, a public that has a good idea of what we want to do, so that everybody can say, these are the things we want to do, why isn't it happening? Right? That's the most important pressure we can put on it. That removes any space for anyone messing around and say, oh, well, it wasn't really the thing that you wanted, it wasn't, you know. And it also reduces the opportunities, and I don't think this is going to happen, to be clear, but it reduces the opportunities for anybody in financial markets who wants to speculate to sort of scare themselves, right? Because you're very clear about what you're doing. There's going to be no surprises here. This is what we want to do. We lay it out. John always says this. You know, there are people in finance who some things that Labour's doing they'll like. If we say we're going to spend a load of money on renewable energy and public transport and really big infrastructure projects, there's a whole load of people in financial markets who go, that's great, we can chip in as well, thank you very much. We like those long-term returns. There's a whole bunch of people in financial markets, hedge funds who are completely speculative, who would hate this. Probably no one really wants to pay more in tax, but that's part of the deal here, right? As long as we're upfront about what we're doing, I think that's our best single defence. But we do need a movement that is informed about this and has a sense of what they want to achieve and is there and able to say, actually, this is what we want, this is what it looks like. And I think already has the experience of trying to put in practice versions of this on the ground. You know, there are more local councils trying to look at doing the Preston model. with varying degrees of how they interpret it, what they're trying to do. But this is step by step. It starts part of how we're building a movement right now, rather than simply waiting there until Jeremy Corbyn gets elected. Just on that, I mean, look, I don't think anyone in this room thinks like this, but you do sometimes get the impression, and I think the experience of the last few years has mostly got rid of this, but that Jeremy Corbyn's elected, he walks in number 10, there's a big old lever that's kind of jammed towards neoliberalism, right? And he just sort of gets it and pulls it over to socialism, and then that's it, job done. We can all get on with, taking up interesting hobbies or whatever it is we want to do instead, right? So we don't have to sit in meeting rooms on a baking hot Wednesday evening. I hate to break it to you, that there is no lever, right? It isn't there. It isn't how things are going to work. So we need an informed mass movement. We need people who are really clued up about the economic arguments, who know what it is you want to achieve and how we get there. What was the other specific question that I scribbled down in that one? It was data. Sorry, yes. The issue with... It's data in the Bank of England. The issue with data, I think you're absolutely right. Are people sort of aware or seen what's happening in Barcelona? We have this very radical mayor, who fortunately is still mayor, and a very good chief technology officer called Francesca Bria and her team, who are busy pushing for this idea that data generated in Barcelona should be the property of its citizens. And part of the way they're doing that has been a bit like the Preston model. So they had a big contract with one of the mobile phone companies. As part of the deal with the council, they said the data generated in this contract is the property of the city, and we're going to treat it as a public good. We want privacy and all the rest of it, but we want to be able to use that data for the benefit of the people here, not just you gobbling it up. And that's quite a good approach, because I think the next frontier of what we want to talk about ownership of is data. And this is bearing down on us. I mean, take the NHS. The NHS is a massively valuable repository of data. It's one of the most valuable single repositories of data anywhere on the planet. And it's valuable because it's really detailed medical information that's very, very trusted by the people who provided it and the people who make use of it. If you are running a company that wants data because this is how it makes money, and artificial intelligence in particular means you need more and more data all the time, this is just this glistening prize that you want to get your claws into, right? That's what it looks like. We don't want that to happen. We need to think seriously about what a socialist data policy would start to look like, and how, because there's a flip side of this. We could use that data for the public good. If it's secure, if it's private, if all these other things, if it's trusted, you could use it to advance medical technology in all sorts of wonderful ways. But we have to have some understanding of how to use that data so we don't just end up selling it all off to the highest bidder. And believe me, I think that's probably, if you're talking about privatising the NHS, this is the thing they're going to come for, right? Over and above anything else. It's an absolute treasure trove as far as sort of private companies are concerned, but we should put it to public use. Specifically on the Bank of England, look, I don't think we should get hung up on the issue of independence of the Bank of England. It was Gordon Brown's big thing with a fanfare in 1997. I did it a week after becoming Chancellor. It was private Bank of England, right? Not private, independent Bank of England, still state-owned. The issue for us is we have to see it as an instrument and a tool, and we have to give it clear instructions what it should do. The role we want is that if John's Chancellor at that point, he needs to set a strategy in the direction, and the Bank of England is there to implement the thing. Which means you get the mandate, which is Treasury sets. At the minute, it just says the Bank of England needs to keep inflation to 2%. And that's all it says. So we write in more instructions. And we can think about what those instructions might be. You might also include, one suggestion was to include a productivity target. There's all sorts of ways that you might want to do this. And as long as those instructions are clear, and we're watching what the bank is doing, then I think that's the issue of independence resolved. It's a tool. In other words, it's not a thing to set the strategy, that should rest with the government, but it's a tool in how you might get the economy to work better. As long as we write the mandate carefully and we say what we want to happen, then I think that deals with the issue of independence or not.
Take a...
There was also prisons and circa.
Oh God, yeah. Yeah, that feels like, I mean, oh God, I feel like that's one of those ones that, I don't know if it's above my pay grade or whatever. I think there's an important point there that we don't want. If we say we want to end austerity, right? And that does include things that matter to people, like the big cuts to police. It does matter, and it does matter that things are being cut. But we also want a vision of society where it's not just like, there's crime, let's have more police. It's saying, what about youth centres? What about giving people other opportunities? It's all the entire package of things. It's changing how these institutions work, right? Which, Diane, as Shadow Home Secretary, is doing a fair bit of work on. And we can always do more and better on this. But I think if we start to put that in the context of what kind of society we want to live in, rather than just falling too easily into just going, more police, deal with crime, there you go. we're not going to do that. We want something bigger and broader than this. We want a vision of a society where people do have opportunities, where it functions properly, where people relate to each other in a much better sense. Right? Put the whole package together and we can get there. And that includes, obviously, dealing with the big structures of oppression around racism and the institutions that are still enforcing this, which includes G4S, Serco, that kind of thing.
We've got time for 2 very short questions. We've got a short question.
I was interested, it's not quite economics, but you said it needs a mass movement for all this information to get out. It's really interesting, but it feels like so many people don't know, and it's not getting talked about enough. And I thought when the manifesto came out, it was so great because everybody liked it, but it feels like it's all gone quiet and we're not getting. How can we do that? What do we need to be doing? And I'm involved with the People's Assembly, but I'm a Labour Party member as well and stuff. So.
And one more. Yeah, back.
It was just about the question of morale, really. So what we've got in Manchester is effectively sort of progression of white regime of people who were defeated in 85 in the Great Capping Rebellion and then felt, well, it's the socialism will never happen, therefore we've got to come to this location. But there does seem to be a whole tranche of the wider party and the wider movement who are, you young people don't understand, we went through this and our dreams were broken. And how do we get over that as a movement, whether it's, is it the case that we need to convince some older comrades that no, it can't still happen, or is it the case that, they have to decide?
Right, so those two relate. So it's basically a question of do we write off the old? That's basically what you're saying here, right? Well, I'm not going to get into the specifics of what's happening in Manchester, although it's the first time I've heard Brezhnev, brought into one of these meetings. So good historic reference there. Look, the two relate. Okay, the issue we've got, bluntly, I think looks like this: 2017, big breakthrough, and then we got that thing of and then what do we do next, right? And that is quite a hard question to answer in lots of different ways, because the issue of 2017 is a bit like, if you asked a bunch of lefties, I'm not letting you in a big secret, this is roughly how the manifesto got written, but if you asked a bunch of lefties to write down quickly all the things they could think of that would be good, right, and then sort of put them in a 128-page document, and there you go, right? That's kind of what happened. Now, we've done that, and it's a big breakthrough. That's not, I don't want to patronise my colleagues and things, but it's like that, we've got a list of things we do. For years, we've had a list of things we want to do, right? This is what's the shocking thing about all of this. For years, if you've been on the left, you had a good idea about the things you could just do. If you magically ended up in government, these would be the things to do. And for years, we're told, no, it's nonsense, it's wildly unpopular. The bizarre thing about that, by the way, is if you look at nationalisation, it's wildly popular. The figures on rail nationalisation, it's like 90% of it, 80%, 80-90%, it's up there. And it's like 70% of Tories think they should nationalise or even higher for UKIP voters, that kind of thing. And then there was one of the Tory think tanks, they had a panic after 2017 because it was like, what the hell are we going to do? Called Bright Blue, that produced a study of attitudes to public ownership. Why did Corbyn do so well? And they were horrified by the young in particular. These people just had no attachment to capitalism. There's some bloody reason. I mean, why is it if you're young in this country you're not particularly keen on capitalism? I cannot begin to fathom. But they did this mad survey. They just asked people loads of stuff. Would you like this to be in public ownership? And it's like railways, yes. Gas, yes. Energy, yeah. All that. You keep going down a whole great list, and you get down to travel agents. 23%, yes. Now, just be clear, because it's being recorded, we're not going to nationalise travel agents, right? But I do wonder who these people are. It's like a quarter of the country. That's great. We'll have a. Anyway, the point is, this is popular. Right, and we knew it was popular, and all these people are banging on about polls and all the rest of it. For some reason, managed to ignore the polling that says this is popular. Taxing the rich, don't talk about tax rises was the rule. Actually, if you talk about taxing the rich, turns out, lo and behold, quite popular. Right, put all that together, and it's the breakthrough. But what do we do next? And what do we do next in changed circumstances? Changed in lots of different ways, and being changed for us. Changed because of climate change, changed because of the data issue, changed because more years of austerity just worsens the kind of consequences of austerity as it goes on. We have to do something more. And that, I hope, is one part of what developing a programme for, if you like, Corbynism 2.0 looks like, which I've sort of talked about a bit here, that we have to think about what we do next, because the challenges are bearing down this quite rapidly. But it's also that thing about mass movement. What do we do to build that? I think, to be honest with you, I think we spent you can end up spending too long thinking about Westminster. Having worked there for like 3 years or something, you start to think it's the entire universe. And like the Westminster bubble does exist. I mean, maybe not in quite the actual physical sense of a big sort of glass dome that encases the whole thing, but at least in people's heads, it sits there. And for us, I think for people connected to what Corbynism, the movement, and what the Labour Party should be doing, is you can't be Westminster bubble people. Never mind that. You've got to get out and build a movement and talk to people. Why did we do so well in 2017? Yeah, partly as a manifesto. But to be honest with you, it was the fact you had thousands of people out, literally thousands of people out, knocking on doors, talking to people. You had rallies, up and down the country. Again, thousands of people coming out to hear Jeremy talk about what we could do that's different and better. We need some of that spirit. We need to think like that. I mean, get out of just fixating on what a few people are talking about. A couple of journalists chatting in one of the bars, and this is like the news for the day. Get out of that, get back into talking to people, build a movement, talk about what the vision of society is that we want, and do that regardless of what's happening in Westminster at any point in time. Just start to make that happen. That, I think, is, in the end, it's the only way we win. I mean, truthfully, like everything else can fall apart. But if we lose the mass movement, if we lose the sense that people want to get out there and fight for this, we lose everything. And we can't lose that, so we have to get out there and fight to make sure it happens. And I think, just quickly on this thing, I think it's really critically important what you're doing in Momentum and other places, putting on sort of educational things, and whether it's a talk or whether it's a reading group, whatever it is, that sense of mass political education. So we have a whole mass movement. It isn't just a load of people who are passively sort of involved. It's a load of people actively involved, discussing with each other, winning arguments, getting out there and fighting for it. That, I think, is in the end what delivers not only the election win, but also how you have a transformative government on the ground.
Great, thank you.